So this is a plenary session, Africa Communicating, Digital Technologies, Representation and Power. My name is Alan Thompson. I teach journalism here at Carleton. I also direct something called the Center for Media and Transitional Societies, which right now has 22 journalism and communication students who are heading to Africa this summer for 8-week media internships. Most of them will be working with news organizations, but some also working with media development organizations. I have an interest in digital media. I was involved with a project called Radio Convergence and Development in Africa, which was looking at the nexus between ICTs, information communication technology, and conventional radio. And it was interesting what we learned in the course of that research program. Really, we learned what we didn't know, the known unknowns. In a sense, I think everyone's heard the cliche, the digital media, mobile revolution, this burgeoning thing that's happening in Africa. We all seem to talk about it, we all seem to hear about it, and it is indeed a cliche, I think, this sort of mobile media revolution. And the fact that it's a cliche doesn't mean that it's not true. It's just people use a cliche so casually that they're not even often quite sure what they're talking about when they use a cliche. So what we're here to do today is to try to give that some thought and maybe sort of put a bit of flesh on the bones of the cliche and look a bit more closely and look particularly for some evidence about what this digital media revolution means in Africa. We have three excellent panelists to take us through that discussion. They're each going to talk for precisely 30 minutes, perhaps a little bit less. And what we'll do is we'll go through them in order. Then we'll open it to a general discussion period rather than doing question and answer with each of the presentations. And I'll introduce them in order, and then I'll ask the first speaker to come up. We have Gado Alzuma, American University of Nigeria. The title of his presentation is The Rhetoric of ICT 4D in Africa. So the cliche, the rhetoric, he's going to deal with that head on. Gado is an associate professor of anthropology at the School of Arts and Sciences, American University of Nigeria. He did his undergraduate and graduate studies in France in sociology, PhD in anthropology at Southern Illinois University. On top of his teaching and research, he's done evaluation work with such organizations as CARE International and the World Bank. In the early 1990s, he was a social advisor to Nigeria's Prime Minister at the time, also did consulting work for UNICEF, later for the IDRC's regional office in Dakar, Senegal. He's widely published, as are all of our speakers, widely published in the field of information and communication technologies for development, the dreaded ICT 4D. His primary area of research and the subject of his paper today. Monica Chibita, Uganda Christian University, titled her paper, New Media, New Representations, Assessing Media Literacy in Eastern and Northern Uganda. After nearly 20 years with the Mass Communication Department at Makerere University, Monica took up a position last year as head of the Mass Communication Department at Uganda Christian University. Monica studied at Makerere, holds an MA in journalism from the University of Iowa, earned her PhD in communication at the University of South Africa. She joined Makerere in 1994 and was instrumental in the school's research program on top of a heavy teaching load. She's a member of the editorial board of Communication, South African Journal for Communication Theory and Research, Equinovi, African Journalism Studies, and associate editor of the Journal of African Media Studies, JAMS. Our third speaker, Wisdom Teddy, University of British Columbia. The title of his presentation, Mobile Phones, Democratic Citizenship, and the Changing Ecology of Political Communication in Ghana. Wisdom is currently the Dean of the Faculty of Creative and Critical Studies and a Professor of Cultural Studies at UBC, University of British Columbia. He studied political science, Russian, and communication studies at the University of Ghana, completed a master's degree in political science at UBC, and a PhD in political science at Queen's. He has a keen interest in the new information and communications technologies and their impact on society, particularly in Africa. He's also engaged in research on the mass media in Africa and their relevance for democratization. Hence his involvement as co-editor of the recent volume, African Media and the Digital Sphere. His paper today is on mobile phones, democratic citizenship, and the changing ecology of political communication in Ghana.
Like Alan told you, I'm teaching at the American University of Nigeria. Actually, what I'm going to talk about is this cliche. When he was doing the introduction, he talked about this cliche, but actually, I would like first to say that there is a discourse, a rhetoric, that is clouding the whole issue of ICTs in Africa. And unless we know the facts, unless we go beyond that discourse, beyond that rhetoric, we would not know how it is actually, because what people are telling us right now is that there are changes that are happening in Africa. It's marvelous that everybody has a cell phone, they have access to internet, etc., etc. But the real situation is far more complex than that. The real situation is far more complex, and also it's not different from what we used to know. It's just that we have this discourse in our mind, and we tend to think that there is something new that is actually happening. So the first thing to know is that most of the issues that we usually discuss in our conferences, they actually find their roots in preoccupations that are preoccupations of Western countries. They find their origins, the discussions, the issues we are discussing actually find their origin in Western countries, because they become issues that are related to Africa. Secondly, apart from the fact that actually they originated, what we are discussing about actually originated from almost every 10 years, we have a new technology that is presented to us as being like the panacea for the development of Africa. There was the era of tractors, then we have had the era of television, the era of radio, the era of computers. In the last 2 decades, it has been thought that computers and internet are transforming Africa, that they are having a revolutionary effects on the economic situation, etc. Now we see that the focus is shifting on mobile phones. People are no longer talking so much about the internet, about computers. They are more talking about the mobile phone. And why are they talking about the mobile phone? Because the reality when it comes to the introduction of computers and the internet is far less amazing than the discourse would let us believe. The penetration of computers and the internet in Africa is still very, very, very low, as we will see. However, when it comes to the mobile phone, 60% of African population have access to the mobile phone today. So this mobile phone thing is clouding the whole issue of the interior of Africa in the information society. And what I want to talk about is to show that even when it comes to the mobile phone, the situation is not really what it is said it is. People do not have access to, having the physical access to mobile phone does not mean that people really use mobile phone the way, for example, they do in Western countries. So that's what my issue, the one problem is what I call the mobile divide. In the same way that there was a digital divide, today there is a mobile divide actually. So what do people tell us when it comes to the internet, computers, mobile phone? They say that they have the ability to promote economic and social development in Africa, and are hastening the continent's entry into the information age. That's what we call leapfrogging development. And these technical objects are presented as having some qualities and potential that are different from all other technologies that have been present in Africa before. For example, it is thought that ICTs are all-encompassing, that they have a leveling effect. What is the leveling effect? It means that there is no class barrier or group barrier between the users, for example. It is also told us that smartphone, for example, will help have access to the internet and erase, for example, the digital divide in Africa. It is said that ICTs are flexible, interactive technologies that have sparked innovative uses and appropriations by Africans. So there is no doubt that there are changes that are happening in Africa right now, and those changes are very important. For example, the average economic growth rate was between around 5.5 between 2001 and 2010. The expected growth rate of 6.2% in 2013, and the 6 countries out of the 10 that have the highest growth rate in the world are African countries today. For example, countries such as Angola, 11%, Nigeria, 8.9%, etc. And it's the IMF that is telling us. So, and 7 African countries will be among the world's 10 fastest growing countries before 2016. And over the next 5 years, the average African economy will outpace its Asian counterpart. So it's almost incredible when we think about how Africa is usually presented in the media. But this time, it is the IMF, very serious organizations that are telling this. And all those figures I am presenting actually come from the IMF. So Africa is really, there are changes that are happening in Africa. There is no doubt about this. And there is also no doubt that the changes are positive. For example, the average per capita wealth grew by 3.5% over the last 10 years. More African children attend school today than ever. There are more democratic elections, although there are still conflictual in many countries. Civil war still exists, but there are not things of the past, but I mean, they are less deadly than they used to be. And there are less countries that are affected also than there used to be in the past. And there is no doubt that ICTs have greatly contributed to those changes. For example, more than 600 million Africans have mobile phones today. So no other technologies has been so rapidly and so widely appropriated by Africans in history. It's something really incredible. I mean, Africa is the fastest growing phone market today in the world, the fastest growing market. And of course, the introduction of ICTs is having also some positive effects, some positive change. For example, it's helping reduce the disparities in access to technologies between developed and developing countries. Probably ICTs is one of the sectors where the difference between developed and developing countries is the most reduced today. And in some sectors, such as, for example, mobile banking, Africa appears to be more advanced than most developed countries in the world. People are using mobile phones in a very innovative ways, things that we don't find, for example, in countries such as the United States or Canada. And there is no doubt that ICTs have greatly contributed to that, because many research has shown that there is a link between the development of ICTs and the GDP growth in Africa. And there is also a link between the development of ICTs and income generating activities. Millions of Africans actually are today employed in the sector of ICTs in Africa. So I'm not going to have some kind of dystopian discourse, etc. I'm not going to tell you that ICTs are not useful, that technology is not useful, etc. Of course, technology is useful, and the computers, the internet, and cell phone also are a positive change that we have to support their introduction. But once we have said that, does that mean that we have correctly assessed the situation? Is the introduction or the physical availability of mobile phones, for example, is it the whole story? Shouldn't we go beyond that? Shouldn't we go beyond that? So that's what, and some of the questions we may ask ourselves are the following. Did Africa really enter the information society, such as it is said today? What of our opportunities and solutions to development problems are missing by focusing solely or mainly on ICTs? Because this is today the trend or the tendency in all development projects, in the United Nations development agencies, in the NGOs, everywhere. The focus is today on ICTs. But what are we missing by focusing almost solely on ICTs? In what ways are ICTs reinforcing or weakening existing and new inequalities? Because some of the things that are never talked about are, for example, inequalities in Africa. When we think about Africa, we tend to think that it's some kind of a uniform world where everybody are the same, equal, etc. But actually there are classes, groups, etc., differences in Africa, and when it comes to access to ICTs, there are also inequalities, even when it comes to access to mobile phone. It is difficult to think that such a tiny object such as the mobile phone could be the object of some kind of social and economic differentiation between people. But actually, there are differences when it comes to the appropriation and the use of mobile phones in Africa. There are differences between people, and that's what I'm going to talk about. And what I want to say is that we should go beyond the fact of equipping people with technology. We should see beyond that what is actually happening in societies, between people, in their relationships, between groups, for example, between men and women, poor and rich, etc. What is actually happening when it comes to technology and the introduction of technology? So my main arguments are the following. The first one is that the rationale behind the rhetoric of ICT4D is to equip people with technologies, not to empower them. The emphasis is on technologies, always on technologies, not people. What I mean is that the whole human dimension of the relationship between technology and people is most of the time forgotten in that discourse. And also, faced with a development problem, the reflex, I have to tell you, I wrote reflex, but I don't know if it actually the correct word here, because I have been primarily educated in French, so my primary language is French. So faced with a development problem, the reflex is always to seek a technological solution. Example, faced with illiterate users, the reflex will be to develop adapted technologies for illiterate users, not to eliminate illiteracy. We are going to see, for example, in countries such as Canada, the United States, and of course developed countries, the question of illiteracy does not exist. But actually, in our countries, in countries such as Niger, think about this, more than 60% of people cannot read and write in Niger. More than 60%. 80% of women, we'll see that, cannot read and write. So the question of illiteracy is a fundamental question when it comes to the appropriation of ICTs. So this supposes that there is only one side of development, the lack of technology. That's what people tend to suppose. Once we have solved this technological side of development, we have solved all problems. Meaning that people always tend to see the problems in the prism of technology and only technology, which amounts to ignoring the many oversights of development, such as, for example, lack of education, illiteracy, for example, lack of basic amenities, etc. So, let's see, for example, the idea that ICTs are, or mobile phone are all-encompassing. I would like to give you a few figures. Africa has only 7% of the internet users in the world. We are doing a whole conference with hundreds of people here talking about ICTs, how it is important in Africa. But actually, who are the users of the internet in Africa? 7% of the population, that's it. That's it, 7%. And 80%, 84% of the African population never uses the internet, never. And also, some countries such as Burundi have only 1.7% users, Chad 1.9%, etc. Very, very low use of the internet. So most of the time when people talk about the ICT revolution in Africa, what they are actually talking about is the mobile phone. It's not actually ICTs, because ICTs is not only the mobile phone, it's also the internet, it's also the computers, etc. But all of this, but not only the introduction of the physical availability, how to use computer, digital literacy, for example, is something very, very important. So Morocco has the highest percentage. Even between the African countries, there are differences, disparities between African countries. So the conclusion is that the celebrated entry of Africa into the information society is solely based on the numbers of mobile phone users. Actually, when it comes to landline phones, the internet, computers, etc., and all of our technologies, actually Africa is lagging behind, far behind the rest of the world. So, our ICT is all encompassing. I would like to show you a website page, the first page of a website. It is LDIS, and this is presented as the gateway for the development. See, there are, I counted 227 documents, each one of them trying to show us that there is some original positive effects of the mobile phone. This is, for example, the first page of the web page of 23 pages of LDIS. See, mobile phone, an appropriate tool for conservation and development. Mobiles and impoverished households in Jamaica. Using mobile phone in fundraising campaign. Mobile phones and development, the future in new hands, etc. Reinforcing inequal gender relations. So mobile phone can help us solve unequal gender relations between people. Agricultural market solve the problem of access to agricultural market, the problem of education. All kinds of problems are said to be being solved by just the introduction of mobile phone. There is some kind of magic effect of the mobile phone. Just because you introduce the mobile phone, people will immediately have access to education, gender inequality will no longer exist. Can we do democratic campaign? For example, democratic election will be possible because of the introduction of mobile phones, etc. And just for one website, the first, you have 1,227 documents, each one of them devoted to one particular good effect, positive, magical effect of the mobile phone, each one of them. That's how things are presented today. And you have hundreds of websites like that. So let's talk about the leveling effect of mobile phone. One of the authors, for example, who wrote about this says this: by being adopted irrespective of developed education and family background, the cell phone bridged at least some gaps between different social classes, meaning that the differences between social classes can be erased through the use of cell phone. Because the poor and the rich, all of them equally have access to mobile phone. The differences are erased between them. Is that true? No. And see what, for example, a survey that has been carried out in Niger in 2009 by the UNDP showed. 10 minutes, sorry. Okay, so I'll finish in 10 minutes. So, for example, rural people, unemployed workers, and people with a low level of education use mobile phone less often than do urban dwellers, and those with a high or higher level of education. And this second group of users also spends much more for their mobile phone than just the overall. Having a mobile phone does not mean that people are using it. And having a mobile phone does not mean that people equally use it and that they have access to all the functionalities of mobile phone. The average expenditure in mobile telephony is higher in urban areas than in rural areas. Mobile phone expenses also account for a larger share of a rural household budget than for urban, meaning that it weighs more on the rural and poor people than it does, for example, for city dwellers and people who are better off. Among rural people and the poor, in both rural and urban, expenditure on mobile phone although way more on other expenses that are essential, such as clothing and food. And there is an in-depth in the group. This, in my point of view, reflect class inequalities. So there is no raising of the differences between class. And it has been shown not only in Africa, but in some other countries and even in the US. Education in general, and what Goodyear calls cultural capital, is an important dimension of the digital diversity. So, something also that he said is that, yeah, it's true that Africans don't have access to the internet and computers, but because they have a smartphone now, it will be possible for them to have access to the internet thanks to smartphones. But who has a smartphone and who can use a smartphone? Think about sending an SMS. If you are an illiterate, how would you write and send an SMS? In countries such as Niger, for example, where 60% of adults cannot read, so we should go beyond the physical availability. People may well have the material means to appropriating cultural goods. For example, they may have the economic capital, at least relatively in some cases, but they may lack also the cultural means, the cultural capital to access technical goods, computers, and the internet. Skills and competencies also have obvious consequences for patterns of mobile phone use. For example, use of SMS or browsing the web. If you're illiterate, it's not because you have a cell phone. What do illiterate people do with the cell phone? They don't do what people who are educated do with the cell phone. They just call and receive call. And sometimes they don't even call. Don't think that because they have the cell phone they are calling. They're not calling because they don't even have the money to call. They usually beep. Beeping means that they call people and they wait to be called back. Yeah, they wait to be called back. That's what happened with poor people in Africa. And also they don't. Illiterate people tend to focus on audio and video functionalities, and smartphones are also more expensive. Poor people tend to choose ordinary phones that don't have those functionalities. Think about this. The price of the cheapest mobile phone in Niger is equivalent to 12.5 kilograms of millet, enough to feed a household of 5 for 5 days. That's the price of a mobile phone. So what would people do in that case? So what is said today is that Africans actually are having innovative uses of the mobile phone. The innovative uses are, for example, beeping or sharing the same mobile phone for many users, use of second-hand phones, social network building for preferential rates and cost reduction. For example, I read a paper by somebody from Burkina Faso who told that, okay, finally, who told me, I will finish, who told us that there is a nurse who is working in a village in rural areas. Every day he has to climb the trees to make calls. And this is presented as a positive, innovative use of the cell phone. Because of course it's Africa. climbing trees to call. So, but credit transfer, or using the phone as a radio, as a lamp, or as a watch, etc. All of those are presented as being innovative and positive uses of the cell phone. But the question we have to ask ourselves are the following. Who are those people who are obliged to invent alternative solutions to use the cell phone? They are essentially those people who are poor because they don't have the means. They don't have the means to pay for the technology. These are the people who are having those innovative uses that are being currently celebrated in the literature. Africans are using mobile phones in innovative ways. But who are those people who are using mobile phones in innovative ways, climbing trees, and using second-hand cell phones, etc.? I said, my conclusion is that actually they are making virtue out of necessity. It's just that they cannot do otherwise. It's not that they are, it's because they cannot do otherwise that they are having recourse to those solutions. Poverty explains the invention of alternative solutions to cope with lack of resources. The innovative solutions are actually a mark of inequality and differential access between users. So my conclusion is the following. The rhetoric of ICT 4D tends to obscure the above-mentioned problems. It tends to make us believe that poverty and development problems only have one dimension, the technological dimension. And my solution for that is I call for integrated development projects. What are integrated development projects? Not just giving cell phones or computers to people, but also educating them, because somebody who is educated better benefit from the use of ICTs than somebody who is uneducated. And think about the social network of somebody who has a higher education and all of the things that somebody who has a higher education can do with the cell phones and computers. And on the other side, think about somebody who is illiterate. What can he do with a cell phone? He can just call and receive calls, not more than that. So we have to educate people in order for them to more benefit from the use of technologies. We have to empower people. Empowering people better benefit from the use of technology, meaning augmenting their social capital. This is what I have to say. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Monica Chibita from the Uganda Christian University. You can look at that slide. I'm not going to go to it right away. It was safer to leave it there. So my presentation will be in two parts. I will begin by sharing some general thoughts on what has been said for and against ICTs and their role in African society and so on. And then I'll go to data from a study that we conducted recently that dealt with issues related to this. Then I'll have some conclusions. And at the end, I'll spend a little more time on the mobile phone and the internet. I'm pleasantly surprised that it's 30 minutes because I thought it was 15 and I had 33 slides. So something happened for me then. So for a long time, I also, before I forget, would like to mention that my husband Mike came all the way to listen to my presentation. He's here. For a long time, the research focus in Africa has been on the traditional media, particularly radio and TV, and their democratic and developmental potential. In the last couple of decades, though, the emphasis is shifting to the new media. When I first started reading about the media and development, one of the first papers I read was Wisdom Tete's paper. So in my mind, Wisdom Tete was this old professor. Really surprised to meet a relatively young man. The potential of new media technologies in Africa has been hailed by many scholars and development partners. Sosha and Eva Schmidt 2012, for instance, argue that new media, and I quote, holds out the possibility of on-demand access to content anytime, anywhere, on any digital device, as well as interactive user feedback, creative participation, and community formation around the media content. Another important promise of new media is the democratization of the creation, publishing, distribution, and consumption of media content, and the death of the gatekeeper. Most technologies described as new media could be described as digital to the extent that they can be easily manipulated and networked and are portable, capable of compressing large volumes of data and enhancing interactivity. The internet certainly falls under this category, as do certain types of mobile phones that meet the above criteria, of the kinds that Gada was talking about with this day. Of particular interest in the African context have been the mobile phone and, to a limited extent, the internet. Scholars have attributed improvement of information gathering, processing, distribution, storage, and engagement with communities to the advent of these new technologies. The technologies have been credited with empowering ordinary people and enabling them to participate in public discourse on such profound subjects as democracy and development. There have been experiments with particularly mobile phones in an attempt to enhance access to and delivery of health, agricultural extension services, education, small and medium enterprise skills, etc. The impact of the new media on culture, identity, and democracy has also been widely discussed. People like Underwood, Maples, Dreyfus, Banda, Mudai, and Tete, 2009, and so on, have talked about these things. However, there has also been a steady stream of voices, we had one this afternoon, cautioning against overstating the magic that these technologies are able to work in African contexts. Fully 2007, for instance, elaborates some of the key criticisms to dampen enthusiasm about the potential of the new technologies. Posa 2001 and Castells 2003, though they acknowledge the potential of the new media, caution about what in neighboring country might be called irrational exuberance. Other scholars, including Azuma 2005, Tumsime 2007, and I know that Azuma has written a few other things, Bowman 2012, Duncan 2013, all caution against getting carried away with the magic of the new technologies without due consideration of the realities within which these technologies are appropriated. As Banda, Mudai, and Tete have argued, and I quote, the value of new media lies in the extent to which they mesh with old media to provide multimedia platforms that allow for greater democratic participation, inclusion, and expression. Discussions of new media often disregard the unusual African terrain, which defies many of the technological innovations said to be reconfiguring the structures and processes of communication globally. This includes poor telecommunication networks in most parts of Africa, resulting in low levels of internet usage. Nevertheless, online communities are emerging across Africa, and although they are mostly among the elite, they show Africans taking advantage of new technology to advance their own identities and agendas. End quote. I quoted that in total because it's fairly important. The realities on the ground in many African countries certainly indicate that there is a gap between awareness and access, and in the case, for instance, of mobile phones, awareness and ownership. There are also critical shortages in the skills to use the technologies, even where accesses are shown. Thus, Furi argues again, even though one may have access to the new media, it may mean nothing if a person or a group doesn't know how to use it in order to gain from it. The computer and the internet on the table in an office, study, telecenter, or post office doesn't guarantee food on the table and should not be presented as capable of doing so. Barton 2002 observes that for some users, the technologies are seen as bestowing status rather than serving as a development tool, so they never really do exploit them for their full democratic or developmental potential. Wilson 2009 argues that the way technological leapfrogging is discussed gives the impression that there is a clear developmental catch-up formula enabled by adoption of the latest technologies from the developed world. Azuma, however, argues that this is not the case. ICTs cannot leapfrog, and I quote Azuma here, ICTs cannot leapfrog beyond the ordinary development problems Africans are faced with. Introducing computers in rural areas, for example, does not automatically solve the problem of illiteracy, health-related problems, or poverty. The solutions to these problems reside outside of the realm of technology. Azuma adds that it's important to bear in mind the reality of the digital divide as well as inequalities in access. One must note, though, that the problem is not inherent in the technologies, but rather in the structures of inequality within which these technologies have been introduced. Policy and regulation to enable or disenable access could be a greater obstacle than the diffusion of new technologies into African societies per se. A significant proportion of findings from empirical studies of the use of the new media technologies in African contexts highlights lack of access, financial resources, infrastructure, and skills to optimize the use of the new media technologies, and indeed some of this research has informed recent development interventions using the new media technologies. And now move to the situation in Uganda. Uganda, like other African nations, has recently experienced great growth in the numbers of mobile phone subscribers, as well as in access to the internet, especially among the youth and the elite. The assumption would be that this has given rise to new synergies between the old and the new, thus expanding opportunities for participation and representation. It is, however, as we have heard, not this simple. The percentage of people who own mobile phones or who have access to the internet is still considerably lower than similar figures related to the traditional media, for instance. So the Uganda Communications Commission, which is the regulatory body, converged regulatory body for telecoms and broadcasting, is in the process of reviewing its communication policy and recently commissioned a study to assess the general performance of the media, gauge the adequacy of local content, identify gaps in policy which need to be addressed in the advent of the new media and the convergence of media technologies. Given the context presented above, it seemed productive to study the new media alongside the traditional media rather than in isolation. I conducted this study along with a colleague, Richard Chibombo, who is not here, who also happens to be a statistician. And like a similar study conducted in 2004 by the same researchers, this study asked some specific questions to gauge whether Ugandans in the eastern and northern region were aware of the new media technologies, had access to them, whether they understood their potential, and what they used them for. We, of course, asked questions about the traditional media as well. Underlying these questions was the question of whether Ugandans in the eastern and northern region, which is what we studied, felt their concerns, political, cultural, religious, etc., were better represented in the media with the advent of the new media technologies. I now move to a little bit of background information before I present the data. How many minutes do I have?
15.
Thank you. So, I don't need to go through this because it's been up there for many minutes. Allow me to move on. There is at least one FM station in most districts of Uganda, and there are at least 112 districts. The TV is less widespread, with the sector dominated by Uganda Broadcasting Corporation, Nation Television, and Waga Broadcasting Services. Radio stations tend to broadcast in one dominant regional language, but include slots of some of the minority languages to cast a wider net. Nationally, English and Luganda are the dominant broadcast languages, with English certainly dominant on television. So the problem that we were trying to deal with was to gauge if available media are serving the best interests of the majority of Uganda, enhancing democracy and development, are respectful of cultural sensitivities, growing evenly and sustainability, and most importantly, if the audiences understand and can evaluate these things. So the study seeks to update the findings of an earlier study, which was done in 2004, and bring on board concerns that have emerged in the last 7 years. In summary, we had 720 household interviews, we had 79 key informant interviews, and we had 35 focus group discussions in 6 districts. The findings, again in summary. How did people people assess the general performance of the media. And this is the media in general, not just mobile phone and internet. These were the findings on radio listenership. The long bar is in radio and TV listenership. Radio listenership and TV viewership. The tall bars are for radio in different districts, and the short ones are for TV. Then the proportion of respondents who rated radio and TV coverage as adequate by district and region. The tall bar is radio in different districts, and the short one is TV in different districts, just to reinforce the previous. Rural-urban disparities in satisfaction with coverage were evident, with urban respondents happier than rural ones. People in the towns and so on feel much happier with to what extent they are covered by radio and television, for obvious reasons, because the stations like to set up more in the urban areas. Then satellite TV is filling the TV vacuum because very few people actually have access to television. Still, very few people have access to satellite television, but at least they can gather around one TV set at a bar and watch a premiership game, which is what they watch. What about their assessment of the role of the media in promoting diversity? The study probed perceptions of the role of the media in promoting political, religious, ethnic, and other types of diversity. Overall, the majority rated the media's performance positively, but there was some hesitation around whether or not, as a whole, the media were free. And this pie chart just summarizes it for us. 35% said free, 31% said not free, and 34% declined to comment, who said they had no opinion. Across the board, the government-owned stations were considered to lack objectivity. Station was considered to lack objectivity. The private stations were looked at more positively, although some said that they are more active during election time. Political and commercial interests and the interests of owners were identified as key influences on the freedom of the media to air diverse political views. I just wanted you to look at 5 minutes, is it 5 or? Okay. I just wanted you to look at 2 quotes that might explain that pie chart. Okay, so basically, people are free to come as long as they can afford it, or as long as the management allows them. And then people are not very keen to comment on this particular issue. Then representing religious diversity, more than half of those interviewed gave the media a favorable rating on representing religious diversity. Muslims who are in the minority said they felt marginalized, but Christians contested this and said the Muslims were dominating the airwaves in some parts of the country. The key factors emerging on religious diversity were who owns the station and what are their inclinations, how much power do they wield, who do they employ, who has money to buy airtime. And this was as true for religious diversity as for political diversity. Generally, there was satisfaction with the availability of programming that addresses women's issues, but there was dissatisfaction with the framing of gender issues, both among male and female respondents. There were complaints about immoral content and the media not being sensitive to the culture. The majority of the respondents said they were happy with the language mix, but it's important to note that there is a very, very strong attachment to the local language, which brings into question the issue of the internet and how much of this it can accommodate. Then on representing identities, the media are doing more to promote local identities than a national identity. This is what came out. Just the way the social setup is and so on, the stations concentrate a lot more on insular issues than on national issues, and people are aware of this. There were concerns expressed about lies in the media and general concerns about lack of professionalism. There were concerns expressed about the cost of TV sets. The majority have no access to the internet at all, or do not know how to use their phones to access it. So we go to the new media. and I hope we have enough time for this. 8 out of 10 respondents reported using a mobile phone, though fewer said they owned one. And you know how this goes, everybody sharing one phone. And so on. Significant disparities in ownership of mobile phones emerged by district, with reported access increasing with urbanness. The more urban the district was, more people owned mobile phones. The tall towers there, the red ones, are use of mobile phones, and the shorter ones are ownership of mobile phones. So use was 83 and ownership was 63%. So what do they use the mobile phones for? Phones were mostly used for networking and business or mobile money transfer. Many do not know that they can access email on the phone or do not have data-enabled phones. Many do not also know that they can access the news or join into discussions on radio and TV. Only 37% reported using a mobile phone to participate in radio or TV programs. However, the focus group discussions, particularly with the youth, showed an appreciation for the synergies between the mobile phones and the traditional media among younger people. This is just a quote again, I think you read it faster than I can. So among the youth, there is a general feeling that they understand the convergence element and how they can optimize this. So who knows about the internet and who uses it? Over half of our respondents across the regions, well, half of the respondents who agreed to answer the question on the internet, because many of them did not, but I don't remember the percentage now, said they had heard of the internet, but only 12% said they had used it. 35% said they usually access the internet from an internet cafe, and other means of access were mobile phones, mobile internet dongle, like flash disk kind of thing, the workplace, and other. What do they use the internet for? The majority of respondents said they use the internet mostly for networking and research. I wasn't too sure about this, but most of these were students. Other uses included recreation and business. And this again, mobile money transfer and striking deals. Only a small proportion of the youth seem to link their access to the internet to increase access opportunities to the traditional media, and therefore increase the opportunities for representation of their views and experiences. To most respondents, the connection between the internet and the traditional media was beyond the scope of discussion. The democratizing role of the media in general was appreciated, but people complained about increasing owner influence, commercial interests, and government influence. Government influence directly on the government-owned station, but indirectly through ownership by politicians. Conclusions. There are relatively few Ugandans that know about the internet and the communication and networking opportunities it offers, and even fewer who use it. These are mostly people 25 years and younger who are educated and urban. There's a limited appreciation of the potential synergies accruing from the convergence of the media. The uses that people who have access to the new media put them to are more likely to be uses that satisfy personal or social needs or confer status, rather than those aimed at loftier goals. Structural factors are still significant for access, and the majority will only benefit from the technologies in an indirect way. Literacy in the new media is perhaps best assessed alongside literacy in the old media, because many developing societies are still grappling with the magic even of TV. The value of the new media lies in how their users optimize synergies with the traditional media to expand the democratic, developmental, and other spaces. Policy may have a contribution to make in dealing with the underlying power and access issues. The realities of the proliferation and use of the new media in contexts such as Ugandans are far from the magical stage envisioned by techno-optimism or techno-utopianism. Policy must not neglect the need to continue opening up access to and capacity for optimizing the traditional media in the excitement of the new media, as it risks leaving out the majority of the population.
So I'll share with you some discussion that focuses on mobile telephony in particular. So I'm not going to be as all-encompassing as my colleagues, where I think they do set a context for for my discussion in a number of ways. So I just want to start off with some discussion about this relationship between ICTs and development, and to interrogate what some of the theoretical and methodological concerns have been about the use of ICTs in development, particularly with regard to politics and democratization. And then I'll focus specifically on mobile telephony in the Ghanaian context, exploring issues that deal with the changing dynamics of telephony in general, and zeroing in on mobile telephony in particular, and try to understand what some of the current dynamics are in terms of how they do shape political engagement. And then I'll focus on some discussion of citizen journalism and the idea of civic intelligence and the voicing of political views by different categories of citizens. And try to look at some of the mundane, seemingly daily, routine conversations that happen via these technologies and the extent to which they do shape the political landscape. And then I'll conclude with some discussion about transnationalism and how that gets implicated in the politics of home, and how mobile telephony becomes an avenue through which these kinds of interactions do take place. So I think, as we've heard, the literature is rife with debate about the relationship between ICTs and politics, particularly regarding the impact of innovations on democratic governance. Many futurists and technologists and democratic theorists have said that the internet and modern technologies are enabling a realization of direct democracy. Now, of course, you've got the critics who claim that they are at best automating existing democratic processes and structures. And on the other end, you've got techno-skeptics who argue that there are no fundamental changes happening as a result of the injection of these technologies, because the fundamental structures that shape political organization, political relationships, have not been significantly affected by the infusion of these technologies. So these debates, have tended to center on the technologies that I think my two colleagues talked about mostly, which have to do with computing and the internet. And we're just beginning to see some incursion into the area of mobile telephony. And so this shift to mobile telephony is not surprising, because I think we did pass the 6 billion mark in 2011 in terms of number of people using mobile phones in the world. So it's not surprising that this has become a significant part of the discourse around technologies. And what they also do facilitate is ubiquitous computing, which, I think, as Monica talked about and Gado mentioned as well, in that on this devices now you're able to access different kinds of capabilities, and the functionalities are quite extensive now, right? And so these devices are becoming, in some way, the very essence of convergence, right? So you can listen to your radio, you can surf the net, you can do all these kinds of things on these handheld devices. So there's significance for both, theoreticians of this global dynamic between technology and development, as well as people who are engaged in the commercial business. Is the level of enthusiasm is gone through the roof, by and large, because for academics, there's a significant new kid on the block that is worth exploring further. For business people in the commercial area of telephony, this is a huge, increase in the market share for their technology and so on. So in some way, these two, converging enthusiasms have, elevated the importance of talking about this technology and what it means for people in different parts of the world. Now, for Africa, I think mobile telephony is particularly important for a variety of reasons, some of which I think people have alluded to in terms of its relative, salience compared to other kinds of ICTs. And this comes from a variety of factors. The fact that it is more preponderant, the fact that it traverses some of the constraints of language and distance and so on, particularly when you're talking about fixed lines and so on. And the fact that it is by and large relatively cheaper, okay? And they're increasingly becoming so. So I know that my two colleagues will talk about the financial constraints on access, but the reality is that in terms of the various kinds of technologies, mobile telephony is in fact relatively cheaper. And in the Ghanaian context, you'll find that the reach is far more significant than it is in some of the areas that we talked about. So it'll be interesting to figure out what the specific dynamics are in these different areas. And so if we look at the fact that Africa is in fact a global leader now in terms of adoption of mobile telephony, and that the language that is being used to describe this, the revolution, is in terms of superlatives, right? Looking at the rate of growth over the last half decade. It is quite mind-boggling to look at. It's probably the fastest technology that's been adopted anywhere in terms of the speed with which it's spread across the continent. So, there's been a lot of work done about mobile telephony and things like telehealth, about, e-banking, and so on. And I think, people do refer to M-Pesa, for example. And so Africa is becoming, in fact, a leader in some of these functionalities that come out of mobile telephony. And I will give you two examples where I think the continent is ready to hear people talking about Africans being at the forefront of innovation. There was discussion about leapfrogging. But there are two areas that I want to share with you where we have, in fact, seen Africa taking the lead. One is with mobile banking, with M-Pesa and other similar things that have happened on the continent that have been adopted elsewhere. The second one has to do with crowd mapping or crowdsourcing, which I think people might be familiar with Ushahidi, which started in the context of Kenya, was used extensively in the Haiti disaster. And so it is not without reason that there's a significant focus on Africa and mobile telephony and some of the things that can come out of there. So what we haven't seen, because there's been a lot of work on the economic impact and the social impact and so on, we haven't seen a lot of the work on political impact of mobile telephony. But part of the reasons, before I get to that, is to just provide some critique of why some people are less enamored of the rhetoric and the talk about this. And I think it's important to look at some of the critiques in terms of it being overly deterministic, and I think we've heard about that. There was also discussion about the kind of theoretical naivety that seems to surround some of these discussions, as though the telephony by itself can be that magic bullet without an understanding of the broader system within which it functions. And I think methodologically it tends to be preoccupied with narrow empirical questions, such as how many websites are there, how many people have mobile phones, what are the number of phones, in circulation, and so on. And there is a lot of this discussion is bereft of the kind of, sophisticated analysis of the nature and the practice of politics that comes through these devices. There's also not a lot of work that's been done about the impact of mobile phones on politics and political behavior. Much of it has centered around cultural and social aspects of technology. So social networking and so on. And we did hear a little bit about the youth and how they use these technologies. And the work that we've seen about mobile telephony has tended to focus on the north. So the global north in particular. And it is, however, very difficult to measure because, as we said, these technologies tend to embody convergence, right? And so how do you isolate the particular impact of mobile telephony when you're zeroing in on that particular technology? And of course, there's a depth of scholarly work on this particular area in the African context. What you tend to see is it being incorporated to larger discussions around ICTs. And we just begin to see some work emerging about mobile phones or cell phones in particular. So what I want to do here is to try to address some of these critiques, and as I try to explore the question of mobile telephony engagement in the Ghanaian context. And I specifically want to look at the extent to which the optimism about the democracy mobile telephony nexus is borne out by the reality in the Ghanaian context. Look at the relationship between citizen usage and political engagement, and explore questions around how mobile telephony becomes a conduit for interest aggregation, for political mobilization, and for civic vigilance, and the extent to which it provides a tool for subaltern resistance, and kind of redefining the direction of the gaze. And of course, looking at the extent to which centers of power are appropriating the technology again for their own particular political purposes as well. So let me touch on the changing dynamics of the telephone industry and its impact on access. And I think this is particularly important in order to get a sense of comparative perspective. So the telephone has traditionally always been a marker of power. Those of you who are familiar with African offices a couple of decades ago, you've got a phone sitting in a particular office, and there's a certain correlation between the location of the phone, just as you said about computers. It was the same thing. And it was a mechanism for, at least to have a conversation. And this has been the case through pre-colonial to early, post-colonial times. And so it's always been a symbol of power, right? And for a lot of people, this was also a marker of social differentiation, particularly in a context where to get a fixed line was a huge challenge, right? But in the last couple of decades, following the liberalization of the telecoms industry, we began to see a change in that. The early adopters were still very much, markers of status, right? And I think you still see that in the context where it's not as extensive. And I think the urban-rural divide that we heard about still reflects some of that dynamic. But in the Ghanaian case, it's significant to point out that mobile telephony now constitutes about 99% of telephone access in the country. And the latest figures I have are from February of 2013, which suggest that the penetration rate is about 102% compared to about 1% for fixed lines, right? And in terms of subscriptions, the figures are over 26 million for a population of 25 million, right? And it's not unusual in most Ghanaian, rural communities to see phones. This is a question about how many people use a single phone, how many people have more than one or two or three, but the reality is that it's quite extensive in terms of penetration. Quality of service is a different matter that we can talk about, but in terms of penetration, this is significant. And this compares to broadband penetration, and so I'm not talking about fixed lines, but broadband, wireless broadband access for internet, which is about 23% in Ghana, which is considered to be the leader on the African continent in terms of penetration of broadband, which is also favorably comparable to what it is in the developed world. Okay. So, there's no question about the extent of spread. Now, what is the impact on politics? I think I look at it in terms of the extent to which it has enabled articulation of voice by citizens who otherwise wouldn't have that. And this is where I think we have to look at this in terms of the convergence of liberal radio, television, and mobile telephony. Because this is particularly relevant in the context of calling programs, which are now very common in a lot of places in the country, but also on the continent. And what talk radio has allowed is citizens being able to inject their voices into political discussions and so on. I'm cognizant of the fact that the particular breed of individual who does this is different, right? So that has to be brought in mind. But what it has done is, for the political active citizen, has had a new venue within which to express himself or herself. It allows ordinary citizens to have their voices in the political, public discourse, and they're also no longer exclusive preserves of particular individuals or elite. And it further allows for some contestation of what is the received wisdom, right, which tends to be the elite discourse. And so now you're able to have people challenge. And so, if a minister says, we've constructed the road in this community, you have members of the community who are able to call in and say, I'm standing right in front of the location, and I don't see what you're talking about, right? And I find that in Ghana, for example, somebody says that, and a call is placed to a minister, they may be driving or whatever, and they respond. So there's a certain instantaneity in terms of the discourse and the response that comes with these things. Now, I think the other dimensions I want to touch on is that it is not always an exemplar of what it is touted to be. The argument is that it becomes this venue for deliberative political discourse and so on. But I think in some areas what is done is look at the threshold for political conflict and so on, right? Because you no longer have a chance to be deliberative. People are able to respond immediately to things. It rushes up the political temperature in a lot of places. It allows quick mobilization of supporters of particular causes. So in Ghana, for example, there have been instances where two members of two different political parties are having a discussion in a radio station. It gets very heated. Phone calls are made. Supporters, gravitate towards that venue. Police have to be called in and so on, right? And so, as much as it allows for that kind of deliberative, public space to happen, we also have these other dimensions that I think we need to look at. One of the biggest areas is with citizen journalism and civic vigilance, and I think that most of the literature you've heard with elections, for example, very much the same case in Ghana, with what is called the parallel voter tabulation, where various media organizations were tabulating their own results and releasing them at the same time as the official electoral commission was doing theirs, allowing for some kind of cross-checking of the evidence. And these are citizens calling in and so on, making it much more difficult. You wouldn't know that in view of the fact that there's a court case going on where there's a challenge about the results, right? But nevertheless, you've seen situations where people are able to instantaneously verify, challenge, results in ways that weren't the case before. I think the vigilance part is important, and a couple of examples in Ghana would be illustrative. One had to do with a judge, a magistrate in the Ghanaian system, who was accused of bribery by some citizens, and vehemently denied it. Now, in the old system, the authoritative voice of the magistrate would have held sway. But what happened was that the citizens had recorded the conversation, they recorded the ask, and recorded the receipt of the funds, right? And so you now have a situation where the subaltern is turning the gaze the other way, and you're capturing things that aren't going to be, contested, by these individuals. I know that there are a lot of places now in Ghana where they'll ask you to turn on your cell phone or take your cell phone before you enter into conversations with people in particular positions. And so the private-public divide and the sacrosanct of the private space has been assailed as a result of these things, right? And I think that it infuses a setting, citizen surveillance in a space that would otherwise not allow. That is not to say that these are not controversial or that they're incontrovertible, right? Because we all know what can be done with images and so on. But the technology has video capture capabilities, it has photographical capabilities that allow people to, for example, say, there's one case going on now where some journalists claim they were slapped by military personnel. Others, the military is denying it. There are videos of the incidents, depending on how you interpreted this was the hand just touched it or it was a slap, right? But citizens obviously have the opportunity to be able to determine who is speaking the truth. Now, because I'm running out of time, I'll just talk briefly about the use of these in political campaigns. This is quite at an incipient stage, but in the last two elections, text messaging has been a big part of the political campaign, even at the level of primaries. where messages have gone around to people, soliciting donations, soliciting support, and so on. So I'll leave that there. But I just want to finally touch on transnationalism. And people talk about the fact that people leave their home, but they don't leave the politics behind. And a lot of Ghanaians, wherever they meet, the conversation will start from food or whatever it is. It will end up with politics, right? And so people in the diaspora are very much involved in the politics of home. And this is something that I've seen in the last 2 election cycles, where in fact we do have political strategists who are located abroad who are very much engaged in discussions about how to deal with things and so on at home. And the reason is because somebody's on the campaign trail, they can still phone somebody here and be able to engage with them in ways that would not otherwise be possible. So just want to conclude by saying mobile phones are changing the form and format of Ghana's political ecology. The depth of engagement through mobile phones are very much based on the level of structural limitations faced by different categories of citizens, and that is absolutely important to keep in mind. I think that the impact varies across the different dimensions of the political landscape, and so there are, in terms of being able to call in and talk about things, in terms of being able to report misdemeanors and malfeasance and so on, you're able to do those kinds of things. What I think is yet to fundamentally change is the very structure of political power in the country, in that the structures have not been assailed to the point where the citizens are in fact able to control the centers of power. That the extent to which the technology changes the political relationships and political structures has not been as extensive or as deep. And that it's important that we don't then look at the technology per se, but on how much social forces are able to rupture those relationships, right? So until we're able to rupture the existing structures and relationships that define centers of power, the technology would not be able to provide that for us. And so, in short, I think mobile phones can facilitate that process of rupture, but they cannot replace it, or they cannot solely drive it. So I'll leave it at that.